AITAH for suing my neighbor after finding out he poisoned my cat for jumping into his yard? I've always found a strange comfort in my quiet little life. A life that felt simple but full. It's just me, my son, and Luna, our sweet, curious cat who's become as much a part of our family as any person could be. At 34, I've come to treasure this small, stable corner of the world we call home. Our days are routine but filled with little moments that make up the heart of my life. Making breakfast with my son, sipping coffee as the morning light filters into the kitchen, and watching Luna prowl around the yard with that wide-eyed curiosity she has. Luna came into our lives 2 years ago. A small bundle of fur with a bold personality and a knack for exploring every nook and cranny. She was gentle but adventurous. A little explorer who never seemed satisfied staying inside for too long. I'd see her wandering the garden, her sleek gray coat blending into the shadows, and sometimes she'd hop over the low fence to explore the neighboring yards. It wasn't uncommon to catch a glimpse of her prowling across a neighbor's lawn or perched on a fence post, looking out over her little kingdom. She never bothered anyone, and I assumed our neighbors had grown used to her. Living in a suburb with closely spaced homes and friendly neighbors, I didn't think much of her little adventures. Our street was the sort where neighbors waved and shared smiles, where kids played in the yards and people helped each other out with small favors. It wasn't the kind of place where you'd expect trouble or hostility, least of all toward a pet. In truth, Luna brought an irreplaceable warmth to our lives. She was there at the end of every workday, greeting us with her soft purrs and nudges. She'd curl up with my son as he did his homework, or climb onto my lap in the evenings when I finally sat down to relax. And in those moments, it felt like she completed our little family, filling the quiet with her gentle presence. Her habit of exploring didn't seem like a threat, it felt more like an expression of her spirit, a part of her I loved and wanted to protect. There were times I worried, of course. There's always a bit of anxiety that comes with letting a pet roam freely. The small, nagging worry that they might stray too far or come to some harm. But our neighborhood seemed safe, and Luna had always been smart about sticking close to home. I trusted her instincts, and so I let her wander, believing that our neighbors were understanding, that they saw her as harmless and would forgive her little trespasses. But as it turned out, my assumptions about Luna's safety and our neighbors' tolerance were heartbreakingly naive. Looking back, it feels surreal to realize how quickly things went from feeling safe and secure to unraveling into something dark. Something I never could have anticipated in our quiet suburban life. It was a day like any other. I came home after picking up my son from school, arms full of bags and groceries, already running through the usual routine in my head. Put everything away, help my son with his homework, and maybe relax for a few minutes with Luna curled up next to me. But as I stepped into the kitchen, that familiar rhythm of routine was shattered in an instant. There she was, my Luna, lying on the cool tile floor, unmoving except for the faintest rise and fall of her chest. Her body was curled tightly, her eyes barely open, her breathing shallow and strained. A sense of pure panic hit me as I dropped everything, the sound of bags hitting the floor a distant echo in my mind. I knelt beside her, gently stroking her fur, calling her name in a shaky voice that was barely above a whisper. She was usually so responsive, so alert, and now she felt fragile, as though even my touch might hurt her. Her condition was beyond anything I could make sense of, and my mind raced, frantically searching for answers. Had she eaten something bad? Did she get hurt somehow? None of it made any sense. Just the day before, she'd been healthy, vibrant, exploring the garden as usual. Now, she was barely hanging on, her weak meow breaking my heart and fueling my sense of helplessness. Without hesitation, I scooped her up, cradling her like a child, and rushed to the car. My son, wide-eyed and silent, climbed into the back seat, clutching his backpack and staring at Luna with a mixture of fear and confusion. The drive to the vet felt endless, every red light stretching out the agony as I whispered words of comfort, begging her to hold on. At the vet's office, they whisked her away almost immediately, leaving me pacing in the waiting room, my hands shaking, my mind spinning through every awful possibility. My son sat next to me, his small hand wrapped around mine, offering a silent, steadying comfort that kept me grounded. Even as fear clawed at me from every angle, the thought of losing Luna was something I couldn't even begin to process. She was more than just a pet, she was a member of our family. A constant presence who had brought warmth into our lives when we needed it most. After what felt like an eternity, the vet finally came out. Her face was serious, her tone soft but grave, as she explained that Luna had been poisoned. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Poisoned? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. She explained that Luna's symptoms matched bleach poisoning and that they were doing everything they could to flush it out of her system. But there was no guarantee she'd recover. Bleach. My mind struggled to piece it together. How could this have happened? I'd always been so careful, so mindful of what Luna might get into. But then a chilling realization began to form. This wasn't an accident. The vet reassured me that they'd done all they could, and that Luna had a fighting chance. I clung to that tiny spark of hope as they led us back to the room where she lay on a small examination table, hooked up to IVs, her fragile frame still as she drifted in and out of sleep. I whispered to her, stroking her fur, willing her to pull through, even as my mind spiraled with questions and fears I couldn't voice. After a few hours, they let us take her home with strict instructions and a bag full of medication. She was stable, but weak, her usual bright-eyed curiosity replaced with a dull, sleepy haze. I held her close as we made our way back to the car, still processing what I'd just heard, still wrestling with the terrible realization that someone, perhaps even someone close to us, had done this deliberately. When we got home, I gently set her down in her favorite corner, tucked her in with a blanket, and gave her some water, my heart aching at her frail form. Exhausted but unable to relax, I went through the motions of unpacking the groceries, trying to keep my son calm and distracted. But the gnawing anger and confusion were overwhelming, clouding my mind with every possible scenario. It was only later, when I was tidying up around the house and spotted our outdoor security camera, that an idea struck me. What if there was something there? Something that could explain this horrible mystery? I hurried over to the footage and began scrolling back through the hours, watching the quiet scenes of our garden play out on the screen. I'd installed the camera for peace of mind, never expecting it to catch anything more than Luna's usual antics or the occasional stray animal. But as I rewound to the previous morning, my breath caught in my throat. There, in grainy black and white, was my neighbor, a man I'd barely spoken to, who lived just 2 houses down. He was standing by Luna's water bowl, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. Then, with a quick motion, he poured something into the bowl before slipping back over the fence. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that someone I'd trusted, even in the distant way that neighbors do, had harmed Luna on purpose. My stomach twisted with rage and disbelief as I watched the video again, each replay sinking the reality deeper into my bones. This wasn't just an accident. It was an act of cruelty. A violation of trust that left me shaken and furious. I thought of Luna, lying weak and unresponsive on our kitchen floor, and the wave of anger surged through me, fiercer than I'd ever felt before. My mind spun with questions and the urge to confront him, to demand answers. But most of all, I felt a bone-deep determination forming. This wasn't something I could let slide. Luna deserved better, and so did I. When I brought Luna home from the vet, I was flooded with relief and gratitude that she was alive. Even if she was fragile and weak, the anger and fear hadn't faded, though they only intensified as I watched her struggle to move, to drink a little water, to do the simple things that used to bring her such joy. I couldn't shake the gnawing sense that someone had done this to her intentionally, and my mind kept spinning as I tried to make sense of it. I found myself replaying every detail of the past few days, wondering if I'd missed something, if there were clues I should have seen. That's when it struck me. A few months back, I'd installed a security camera in the yard for peace of mind. A way to keep an eye on the place while I was out or to capture any wildlife that might wander through. I'd completely forgotten about it until now. My heart raced as I hurried to access the footage, hoping, yet dreading, that it might hold the answers I needed. I scrolled back to the day before. The morning Luna had gone out into the yard. I was half prepared to find nothing, thinking maybe she'd just wandered somewhere she shouldn't have, or that this was some tragic accident. But as I watched, something on the screen made me freeze. There, in plain view, was my neighbor, a man I barely knew. A man whose face I recognized only from the occasional nod or quick wave as I passed by. He was standing in my yard, near Luna's water bowl, looking around nervously, glancing over his shoulder as though he were afraid someone might see him. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as he reached into his pocket, pulled out a bottle, and poured its contents into her water bowl. In that instant, all the pieces clicked into place, and a wave of cold rage washed over me. My suspicions had been right. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate, an act of cruelty by someone who had no right to even be in my yard, let alone harm my pet. I felt a sickening mixture of anger, betrayal, and disbelief. I could barely believe what I was seeing, my own neighbor calmly poisoning my cat, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I replayed the footage several times, hoping to find some other explanation, something that might make this all make sense. But there was none. He hadn't stumbled in by mistake. He hadn't accidentally spilled something in her bowl. He'd come prepared, intending to harm her, with no regard for her life or for how much she meant to us. A million questions swirled through my mind, each one more frantic than the last. Why would he do this? What had Luna ever done to him? She was an innocent cat, a creature who did no harm, who simply enjoyed exploring the neighborhood, watching birds, and wandering through the gardens. How could anyone see her as a threat, let alone a target for something so vicious? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had always believed in the goodness of people, especially in my own neighborhood. We were a community, a place where people smiled and helped each other, where kids played in the streets and everyone looked out for one another. But now, that sense of trust had been shattered, and it hurt in a way I hadn't expected. I realized that my family, my son, and even Luna had never truly been safe here, not with someone capable of such cruelty living just a few doors away. My hands shook as I closed the laptop, a steely resolve beginning to settle within me. I couldn't let this slide. I couldn't just pretend this hadn't happened, let my neighbor go unchallenged, or brush it off as some petty grievance. Luna deserved justice, and I owed it to her, and to myself, to make sure he was held accountable for what he'd done. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside me. My first instinct was to march over to his house, to confront him face to face, to demand answers. I wanted to see the look on his face, to see if he'd even have the nerve to deny it. I wanted him to know that I knew, that his cruelty had not gone unnoticed or unchecked. But as I imagined it, I felt a flicker of hesitation. Confronting him might give him a chance to deny everything, to twist the story, or even to retaliate. I had the footage, clear as day, but confronting him without witnesses felt risky, especially given how brazen he'd already proven himself to be. And then there was my son to consider. The thought of escalating things without a plan made me pause. I couldn't allow this to backfire, to put us at risk of further harm. The anger didn't subside, if anything. It grew stronger, but now it was directed and focused. I realized that I needed to take this to the authorities. This wasn't just a neighborly disagreement, this was animal cruelty. Plain and simple. I needed to make sure that what he did was on record, that he couldn't just brush this off or wave it away as a harmless prank. With my mind made up, I saved a copy of the footage, backing it up in multiple places as a precaution. I knew that I would need every piece of evidence I could gather. My anger burned hotter with every step, every click of the computer as I prepared myself to report him. I knew it wouldn't be easy. I could already imagine the judgment, the mixed opinions, the neighbors who might think I was blowing things out of proportion. But I also knew I couldn't stay silent. As I looked over at Luna, her small, weakened body curled up on her blanket, I felt a surge of determination. She had trusted me to protect her, to keep her safe, and I'd failed, but I could still do right by her. I could still stand up for her and for myself, to make sure this man didn't get away with what he'd done. And so, I made the decision to file charges. I knew it would be an uphill battle. And I could already anticipate the backlash from my neighbor and maybe even from others who didn't understand the depth of what I was feeling. But I was ready for it. I owed it to Luna, to myself, and to the sense of safety he'd so thoughtlessly violated. This wasn't just about seeking justice for what he'd done to her. It was about reclaiming my peace of mind, my faith in the place I called home, and proving that no one, especially not someone who acted with such cruelty, had the right to take that away from me. After a restless night, filled with half-formed plans and roiling anger, I knew I couldn't keep what I'd discovered to myself any longer. As soon as I'd made the decision to confront my neighbor, I felt a sense of resolve settle in, but with it came a ripple of anxiety. I'd never had a confrontation like this. Never been in a situation where I needed to accuse someone so directly, let alone for something so shocking and cruel. I took a deep breath, replayed the footage in my mind one last time, and headed down the street. The air felt heavy, and my heart pounded as I approached his house. A tidy home that matched the quiet character of our neighborhood. I wondered if the people inside knew who he really was, if they had any idea of the person he'd shown himself to be. The whole walk over, I wrestled with a part of me that didn't want this confrontation. That hoped I was wrong, that maybe he'd say something to make sense of it all. But as I reached his doorstep, I steeled myself. I couldn't back down. With a firm knock, I waited, fists clenched, bracing myself for whatever he might say. When he finally opened the door, his face registered mild surprise, then shifted to guarded irritation. It was a look I recognized, a mask of feigned innocence. The type of face you'd wear when expecting trouble. The sight of it only confirmed my suspicions, fueling the anger that had simmered in me since I'd seen the footage. Without preamble, I held up my phone and pressed play, showing him the video of himself in my yard. He barely flinched as the scene played out, him looking around, pouring bleach or whatever poison he'd chosen into Luna's water bowl. His face remained set, showing a flicker of annoyance, but no guilt, no remorse. As the video ended, he gave a small shrug, looking at me with a mix of defiance and disdain. "It's not my fault if your cat goes where it shouldn't," he muttered, his voice cold, as if his words were nothing more than common sense and I was overreacting. The shock of hearing him actually try to justify what he'd done hit me like a punch to the chest. He wasn't denying it, wasn't even trying to hide his contempt for the life he'd almost taken. His words seemed to hang in the air, but all I could feel was rage, a simmering, quiet fury that I forced myself to hold in check. I reminded myself that I wasn't here to lose control, I was here to make him accountable. To confront him with the harm he'd caused. "Do you even understand what you did?" I managed, my voice trembling, not from fear but from the effort it took to keep my composure. "She could have died, you could have killed her." For a brief moment, I thought I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of something that looked almost like guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. He crossed his arms, his stance bracing, defiant, as he looked back at me. "Maybe you should keep her inside if you care so much. I'm not responsible for where she goes or what happens when she gets there." His tone was so casual, so dismissive, that it felt like a slap. I'd thought this conversation might give me some semblance of closure, but all it was doing was laying bare the cold indifference he felt toward my family, my home, and the life of my pet. I wanted to scream, to shout, to tell him exactly how vile he was. But the exhaustion from it all weighed on me, keeping me quiet, grounded. With a deep breath, I told him I had video proof and that I was prepared to report him for animal cruelty. I was done being polite, done trying to find some sense of understanding in him. His face twisted slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. But he quickly dismissed it, his expression slipping into a bored indifference. "Fine, do what you want," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You should really just keep your cat under control." And with that, he shut the door in my face. I stood there, staring at the door, feeling an icy rage take hold. There was no remorse, no regret, not even a trace of humanity in him. He genuinely thought he was justified, that he had the right to harm Luna because, in his eyes, she was a nuisance, a trespasser. And I realized, standing on his doorstep, That this was no simple neighborly disagreement. This was cruelty, plain and simple, carried out by a man who felt no shame for the pain he caused. As I turned and walked back toward my house, the anger continued to simmer. But now it was laced with determination. This wasn't just about Luna anymore, this was about the principle. About making sure that he couldn't simply hurt others without consequence. The idea that someone like him could live beside me, beside my son, unbothered by the harm he was capable of, shook me. I knew what I had to do. Even if others wouldn't understand. Even if it meant taking him to court. I couldn't let him walk away from this without facing consequences. Back home, I found Luna curled up in her favorite corner, looking at me with those familiar, gentle eyes. I felt a swell of protectiveness and affection wash over me. A reminder of why I needed to act. Luna trusted me, depended on me, and I owed it to her to stand up for her, to make sure that no one would ever threaten her again. And as I sat there, gently stroking her soft fur, I made a promise, to myself, to Luna, and to the sense of peace I wanted to reclaim for my family. No matter how difficult it might be, no matter what the cost, I would see this through. After the confrontation, I returned home feeling raw, my mind filled with a chaotic swirl of emotions. Rage, grief, confusion, and the overwhelming need to protect Luna and my son. I wanted nothing more than to make my neighbor pay for what he'd done. To ensure that he understood the seriousness of his actions. But as the initial surge of anger began to subside, the reality of my decision started to weigh on me. Filing charges wasn't a small step. It meant legal battles, court dates, and, potentially, the kind of neighborhood scrutiny I'd never had to deal with before. I knew there was a chance I'd be painted as the overreacting neighbor. The one who couldn't take a hint. Who didn't know how to keep her cat under control. Some people wouldn't see it for what it was. A calculated act of cruelty against a harmless animal. They would see me as the instigator. The troublemaker. I mulled over these thoughts as I made a cup of tea. Feeling the exhaustion settle into my bones. Part of me wondered if this was worth it. Could I really take on this battle? Would the backlash be more than I could handle? I paced around the kitchen, my mind racing through possible scenarios. I knew that suing him would escalate things. It wouldn't just be a simple complaint, it would be a public stand. A declaration that I would no longer accept his cruelty or his disregard for the lives of others. But what choice did I have? Ignoring it felt impossible. Every time I looked at Luna, curled up weakly in her corner, recovering from the trauma he had caused, I felt a wave of protectiveness and anger wash over me. I couldn't shake the image of her lying there, barely clinging to life because of his selfish, heartless actions. And if I let this slide, who's to say he wouldn't do it again? What if his actions grew bolder? His targets larger? I had my son to think about, too. Living next to someone capable of such cruelty felt like a ticking time bomb. I needed advice, so I turned to the people I trusted most, my family and closest friends. I called my mom first, hoping she'd validate my decision. But her reaction surprised me. "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" she asked. Her voice filled with concern. "Once you start, there's no turning back, and you'll have to live next to him through all of this." Her words hit me harder than I expected. The thought of living with that constant tension, of feeling the eyes of neighbors on me, judging, speculating, made me hesitate. I could tell she wasn't trying to discourage me, but I could also sense the underlying worry in her voice, the fear that I'd be putting myself and my son in a difficult position. "Just think about it, honey. I know you're angry, but you have to decide if this is the fight you want to take on." That night, I called a few more friends, each conversation revealing a spectrum of opinions. Some supported me wholeheartedly, sharing my outrage, insisting that what he did was inexcusable and that I had every right to seek justice. "It's animal cruelty, plain and simple," one friend said, her voice brimming with righteous anger on my behalf. "He shouldn't get away with this. And if you don't stand up to him, he'll think it's okay to keep doing it." But others were more cautious, warning me that suing a neighbor could bring complications I hadn't anticipated. They pointed out the risks, the potential for retaliation, the strain of a prolonged legal process, the chance that things might escalate beyond control. One friend, Jenna, voiced concerns I hadn't even considered. Are you sure he won't try to make things worse? People like that don't just back down. He might even try to twist this against you. Turn the neighborhood against you. As much as I wanted to ignore these doubts, I couldn't. They lingered, weaving into the fabric of my thoughts, creating a web of fear and hesitation. I'd moved here to give my son a safe, stable environment, a peaceful neighborhood where he could grow up without worry. The idea that I might be inviting conflict into our lives felt like a betrayal of that goal. And yet, how could I let this man walk away from what he'd done? His conscience clear, while Luna suffered and recovered from his attack? As I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, a quiet resolve began to form. I thought about what it would mean to let this go. To let him get away with his cruelty without facing any consequences. I thought about how I would feel every time I saw him, knowing that he was unpunished, that he believed his actions were somehow justified. I would feel powerless, compromised, always wondering if he'd do something else, always fearing what he might try next. And I knew that wasn't a life I could accept. I decided to press charges, to take this to court, not just for Luna, but for my own peace of mind, for the security of my family, and for the principle of it. This wasn't just about a single act of cruelty, it was about standing up for what was right. About refusing to let someone with so little empathy or remorse believe he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. The next morning, I contacted the local animal control and then the police, explaining what had happened and showing them the footage. I could hear the shock in the officer's voice as he watched the video. His reaction giving me a small sense of validation that this was indeed the right thing to do. Filing charges felt surreal, like stepping into an entirely different world. One where I had to learn about the legalities of animal cruelty and how to protect myself legally. But each step I took made me feel a little stronger, a little more certain that I was doing what needed to be done. The aftermath was immediate and, in some ways, exactly as I'd feared. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and I began to notice the sidelong glances, the whispers. Some neighbors seemed supportive, nodding sympathetically when they saw me, even offering words of encouragement. But others were distant, their expressions tight and uncomfortable, as if I'd disrupted the peace of our little community by taking this matter public. I even received a few messages from people I barely knew, suggesting that I should let it go and not make a big deal out of a misunderstanding. It was maddening, knowing that these people didn't see the footage, didn't feel the betrayal I felt, didn't see Luna suffering and struggling to recover. To them, it was just neighborhood drama, a petty squabble that should have stayed quiet. But I couldn't let their words shake me. I reminded myself of why I was doing this, of the principle I was standing up for. It was exhausting, both emotionally and mentally. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I'd taken the right path or if I'd walked us into a conflict that would only bring more stress. But every time I looked at Luna, still moving slower than usual, still recovering from her ordeal, my resolve hardened. This was about more than just one cat, more than just one man's cruelty. It was about my family's safety and my own self-respect. In those moments, I felt a deep sense of determination. I wasn't just doing this to punish him. I was doing this to reclaim my own peace. To remind myself that I had the strength to protect the ones I loved. To show my son that standing up for what's right sometimes requires courage, even when others don't understand. And in that realization, I found a sense of purpose, a strength I didn't know I had. As the paperwork piled up and the court dates approached, I prepared myself for whatever lay ahead. I knew it wouldn't be easy, that I'd be tested and judged by people who didn't understand. But I also knew I couldn't back down. This was my fight now, my stand, and no matter the outcome, I was ready to see it through. For Luna, for my son, and, ultimately, for myself. The day I officially filed charges against my neighbor, a strange mix of relief and dread settled over me. I had made my decision, and there was no turning back. The process was more exhausting than I'd expected, requiring me to recount everything in detail for the police report, to relive the horror of finding Luna poisoned, and to watch the footage of my neighbor sneaking into my yard and pouring bleach into her bowl over and over again as I described the incident. With each retelling, I felt the burn of anger and sorrow, but also a growing resolve to see this through. The officer I spoke with was sympathetic, his voice calm and reassuring as he walked me through the process. And his support was a small but important validation that what I was doing was right. He told me it could take weeks, even months, before the case would reach court, and advised me to be prepared for the emotional toll it might take. I nodded, feeling a weight settle in my chest. The reality of the battle I was stepping into sinking deeper with every word he said. Not long after I filed the charges, word began to spread through the neighborhood, and reactions poured in, as varied as they were intense. It was as if everyone I knew suddenly had an opinion on what had happened and on my decision to escalate it. Every walk through the neighborhood, every trip to the grocery store, and every time I ran into someone I knew, I could feel the weight of judgment pressing down on me. I noticed the change in the way people looked at me. Some with support, others with confusion or even disapproval. Some neighbors openly supported me, offering quiet words of encouragement or a sympathetic smile as I passed. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman next door, stopped me on my way home one day. She reached out and placed a gentle hand on my arm, her eyes filled with understanding and empathy. "You're doing the right thing, dear," she said softly. "People like that shouldn't be allowed to get away with hurting innocent animals." Her words warmed me, filling me with a sense of relief and solidarity that I desperately needed. But others weren't as understanding. I could feel the subtle chill from some neighbors who seemed to think I'd gone too far, disrupting the peace of our little community over just a cat. I'd catch snippets of hushed conversations as I passed, half-spoken comments about how some people don't know how to mind their own business, or how I was overreacting. Even a few friends reached out to suggest, politely but pointedly, that I should have handled it privately, that going to court would only escalate the issue and make things uncomfortable for everyone. It stung, more than I wanted to admit. Their words made me question myself, whispering doubts that maybe I was indeed the problem, the person stirring up trouble where it could have been avoided. But I couldn't bring myself to back down. The thought of letting him get away with it, of allowing him to continue thinking that harming someone's pet was a minor indiscretion, felt intolerable. Every time I saw Luna curled up, slowly regaining her strength but still more lethargic than she'd been before, I knew I was doing the right thing. This was bigger than just our neighborhood. It was about setting a standard, about making sure he understood that cruelty had consequences. One evening, I received a call from Jenna, one of my close friends. Her tone was cautious, as if she didn't want to upset me, but she seemed torn. "I get it. Really, I do," she said, hesitating. "But are you sure this is worth it? I mean, suing a neighbor? You're going to be living next to this guy for a long time. And you have your son to think about too. What if he tries to retaliate? Sometimes people like that, they don't take things lying down." Her words echoed my own fears, ones I'd wrestled with since making my decision. The possibility of retaliation, of things escalating beyond my control, was always there, lurking in the back of my mind. But I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I had already taken steps to ensure our safety, installing additional cameras, bolting down our fences, even moving Luna's outdoor setup closer to the house, where I could keep a closer eye on her. I'd gone as far as I could to protect us. But I knew that if I backed down now, I'd be giving him power over my life, over our sense of security. The court date arrived sooner than expected. I was nervous, heart pounding as I walked into the courtroom, gripping a folder with the evidence, the security footage, the vet bills, my notes on everything that had happened. The sight of him sitting across the room filled me with a renewed surge of anger and resolve. His face was expressionless, his gaze steady, almost bored, as if this entire ordeal were a minor inconvenience, something he'd rather not have to deal with. That indifference made me seethe, reminded me exactly why I was doing this. He needed to understand the pain he'd caused, to see that there were consequences to cruelty. The court proceedings were a grueling experience. His lawyer tried to turn the tables, painting Luna as a nuisance, and suggesting that her constant trespassing was a disturbance, an annoyance that had forced my neighbor to act. They tried to make it seem as if he'd been left with no choice, as though my lack of control over Luna somehow justified his actions. Each argument they presented felt like a slap, as if they were trying to shift the blame onto me, to frame me as the irresponsible pet owner who'd neglected her duty. Sitting there, I felt a strange combination of anger and strength. I knew Luna was no menace, she was a harmless, curious animal who had never caused anyone trouble. Their attempts to vilify her, to twist the situation to make it look as though I'd brought this upon myself, only fueled my determination. When my turn came to present the evidence, I did so without hesitation, showing the footage, describing Luna's suffering, explaining the lasting impact this had on our lives. I wanted the judge to understand that this wasn't just about a pet, it was about protecting the vulnerable, about standing up against needless harm. In the end, the court ruled in my favor. My neighbor was found guilty of animal cruelty and given a fine, with a warning that any further incidents would lead to more severe consequences. It wasn't the harshest penalty, but it was a clear message. His actions weren't just ignored, they were condemned. As I walked out of the courtroom, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washed over me. The battle was over, but the experience had changed me. I felt both proud of what I'd done and saddened by the cost of it all, the judgment from my neighbors, the strain with friends who hadn't understood, the fear of retaliation that still lingered. Back at home, I gave Luna an extra long cuddle, feeling the tension in my shoulders finally start to release. This whole ordeal had been for her, for my family, and for my own peace of mind. I hadn't taken the easy road, but I'd done what I knew was right, and that, in itself, was enough. The neighborhood never quite returned to the way it had been before. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, and I could still sense the silent judgments from a few. But there were also the smiles, the knowing nods, the quiet signs of support that reminded me I wasn't alone. For those who understood, who saw the situation for what it was, I was grateful, and for those who didn't, I no longer cared. I had faced down my fears, held someone accountable for cruelty, and learned that sometimes, the hardest path is also the most necessary. Preparing for the court case consumed my days in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every spare moment was filled with paperwork, meetings, and calls to gather evidence. Each step of the process felt surreal, as if I were trapped in someone else's life. But there I was, diving into legalities, reviewing animal cruelty statutes, and filing forms, determined to hold my neighbor accountable. Every time I felt myself waver, I'd look at Luna, still slowly regaining her strength, her eyes softer and less alert than before. It fueled my resolve, reminding me why I couldn't turn back. The night before the court date, sleep was elusive. Doubts crept in, whispering to me in the dark. What if I'd overreacted? What if I'd made the wrong choice? My mind drifted back to the warnings and worried expressions of friends and family, to the way certain neighbors avoided me, shaking their heads or offering half-hearted smiles when we crossed paths. It was hard to push away the thought that I'd somehow made myself an outcast, all for taking a stand. But then, I'd remember that chilling footage, my neighbor, with his cold, calculated indifference, pouring poison into Luna's bowl. The memory reignited my anger, solidifying my resolve. This wasn't an overreaction, this was a clear, intentional act of harm. I reminded myself that this wasn't just about justice for Luna. It was about reclaiming our home, our safety, and making sure he understood that his actions had real consequences. When I arrived at the courthouse, the reality of what I was doing hit me all over again. The courthouse loomed large and intimidating, the sterile corridors lined with people waiting to have their own cases heard. I felt a sense of isolation that I hadn't expected, surrounded by strangers yet feeling intensely alone in my own struggle. As I sat there, waiting to be called in, a flood of anxiety swept over me. My heart raced as I tried to remind myself of the evidence I had, of the strength it had taken to get this far. I looked down at my folder, filled with security footage, vet bills, and notes I'd made to keep my thoughts organized. I'd come prepared, and I wasn't going to let him walk away from this unscathed. Finally, the moment came, and I found myself facing him across the courtroom. The sight of him sent a surge of anger through me, but I kept my expression neutral, my jaw tight. He looked as indifferent as ever, his gaze meeting mine with a flat, almost bored expression, as if the whole ordeal were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. His apathy was infuriating, a clear reminder that he felt no remorse, no guilt, no understanding of the pain he'd caused. The court proceedings were emotionally taxing. His lawyer's tactics were every bit as infuriating as I'd feared. They tried to paint me as the negligent pet owner, twisting every fact they could to imply that Luna was a nuisance, an intruder who had invaded his space. They argued that he'd simply taken action to protect his property, and that perhaps I should have been more careful about where Luna wandered, hearing them talk about her as if she were some kind of pest, rather than the sweet, gentle cat who had brought so much joy to my life, made my blood boil. Each word felt like a slap, a reminder of just how far they were willing to go to deny any wrongdoing. But I didn't back down. When my turn came, I presented the evidence with a calm, unwavering determination. I played the footage, letting the room fill with the stark, undeniable reality of his actions. I described the scene I'd come home to, the sight of Luna lying limp and barely breathing on the kitchen floor, the frantic drive to the vet, the hours of waiting, praying she'd survive. I recounted each excruciating moment, each instance of helplessness, each pang of betrayal. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of my own emotions, a mix of grief and fury that had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks. The judge listened, her expression solemn, her gaze steady. I hoped she could see the impact of his actions, that she understood this wasn't just about a single incident, but about the betrayal and the violation of trust in a place that was supposed to be safe. The court found him guilty of animal cruelty, and though his sentence wasn't as severe as I might have wanted, it was enough to bring me a measure of closure. He was given a substantial fine and a warning that any further incidents would lead to more serious consequences. I knew it wasn't a perfect victory. No legal ruling could ever fully make up for the pain and fear he'd caused. But seeing him held accountable, seeing him face even a sliver of consequence, felt like a step toward reclaiming my peace. Leaving the courtroom, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. The fight had been won, but at a cost. I was emotionally spent, drained by the intensity of the experience, the strain of facing him and reliving everything that had happened. I walked out into the sunlight, the brightness almost overwhelming after the dimness of the courtroom, and I let out a shaky breath. It was over, but the scars of this experience would linger. In the days that followed, I noticed the subtle shift in my neighborhood. Some people, those who had supported me from the start, offered quiet words of encouragement and understanding. They understood the gravity of what had happened, and their support was a small comfort, a reminder that not everyone was blind to cruelty. But there were still the whispers, the sideways glances from those who didn't understand, or who chose not to. I felt their judgment, their disapproval, as if I were somehow in the wrong for taking a stand. It was hard to shake the feeling of isolation, the sense that my decision had made me a stranger in my own neighborhood. I had taken a stand, held someone accountable, but in doing so, I'd revealed a darkness that not everyone was willing to confront. Some saw me as a troublemaker, a disruptor of the peace, someone who'd brought conflict into an otherwise quiet community. It stung, more than I'd like to admit. But every time I looked at Luna, now recovering and slowly returning to her old self, I knew I'd done what was right. The experience had taken a toll on me, leaving me with a deeper understanding of the complexities of justice, of the price of standing up for what's right. I'd entered this battle with a sense of righteousness, but I'd come out of it scarred, changed. I felt stronger, yes, but also more cautious, more aware of the weight that justice could carry. As I watched Luna play in the yard, now under my careful watch, I felt a sense of peace that had been hard-won. I knew that things might never return to the way they'd been before, that the sense of innocence I'd once felt in my neighborhood was gone. But I'd gained something else, a renewed strength, a knowledge that I could face down cruelty, even when it came from close to home. The court case, the judgment, the mixed reactions from my community, none of it could erase what had happened. But it had given me a sense of resolution. I had done what I could, taken every step I could think of to protect my family and my home. And while the scars would remain, I knew I could live with them. proud of the strength it had taken to stand up and say, "Enough." The toll had been steep, but it was worth it. And in that small, quiet victory, I found a sense of closure that no amount of neighborhood gossip could take away. The days following the court case were strangely quiet, almost hollow. There was a sense of finality in knowing the case was closed. That I had done everything I could to stand up for Luna, my son, and our safety. But despite the court's judgment, I still felt a weight lingering over me. The effects of everything that had happened settling into my bones in ways I hadn't anticipated. The relief I'd expected to feel was complicated, tangled up with emotions I was struggling to unravel. I'd taken on this battle and won in the legal sense, but it had cost me a sense of peace and connection within my own community. The neighborhood that had once felt so comfortable, so stable, now felt different, colder. Somehow, the people I passed on the street either avoided my gaze or gave me those forced smiles, as if they were uncertain how to act around me now. As much as I tried to brush it off, the whispered judgments and strained interactions wore on me. I'd hear comments from neighbors when they thought I couldn't hear. Small, biting words about the woman who went too far over a cat. Or complaints that I'd disrupted the neighborhood peace. These murmurs made me question myself in quiet moments, as I wondered if I'd pushed too hard. If I should have handled things differently. Had I been the one to ruin something good in our community? Or had I simply shed light on something everyone wanted to keep hidden? My son picked up on it, too. He was old enough to notice the stilted greetings from neighbors or the way people stopped talking when we walked by. One night, he asked me if everything was okay. His voice small and uncertain. "People are acting weird," he said, his brows furrowed with worry. I assured him that everything was fine, trying to keep my tone light, hiding my own doubts. I told him we'd stood up for Luna, for our family, and that not everyone understood. But that didn't make our choice wrong. I wanted him to feel safe, to know that standing up for what was right sometimes came with sacrifices, even if it meant feeling a little bit alone. But his worry stayed with me, making the consequences of my decision feel even heavier. To cope, I turned inward, focusing on creating a new sense of peace within our home. I threw myself into little projects, building a small garden for Luna to play in safely, where she could watch the birds and butterflies from the safety of our yard. It felt almost therapeutic, reclaiming our space and transforming it into something beautiful and secure. A sanctuary where Luna and my son could feel safe. I took comfort in creating something tangible, something positive, to counter the negativity that lingered around us. Luna's recovery was slow but steady. She began to show glimpses of her old self, padding around the yard with a bit of her former curiosity, though she was still more cautious than she had been before. Seeing her regain her confidence, however fragile, gave me a sense of validation, a reminder that my actions had been worth it. I'd fought for her right to exist peacefully in her own home. And watching her regain her spirit was a reward that made the challenges of the past few months feel justified. Throughout this time, I found solace in the quiet support of a few loyal friends who had stood by me unconditionally. They reminded me that my actions had meaning. That justice for Luna was more than just a personal victory, it was a stand against cruelty and indifference. My friend Sarah, who had been there from the beginning, was a lifeline during these moments. She reminded me that I had done something brave, something necessary, and that the loneliness I felt was temporary. People don't like facing ugly truths, she told me one afternoon as we sipped coffee on my porch. But that doesn't make those truths go away. You did the hard thing, the right thing, and eventually, people will see that, or at least they'll stop judging you for it. Her words stayed with me, grounding me when doubts crept in. I realized that my neighbor's cruelty had exposed something deeper, an unwillingness to confront the uncomfortable. The dark side of human nature that everyone would rather ignore. And in a strange way, that understanding gave me a sense of empowerment. A sense that I was reclaiming my life on my terms, even if it meant pushing back against the expectations of those around me. I began setting new boundaries, reinforcing my yard with higher fences and installing additional cameras, ensuring that Luna would be safe even in the unlikely event that someone tried to harm her again. Each change made our home feel a little more secure, a little more protected. These actions felt symbolic, like a statement that our lives and our safety mattered, that we wouldn't be intimidated or forced into silence. Over time, the wounds began to heal, both physically for Luna and emotionally for me. I found myself reconnecting with the person I was before this all began, someone who believed in kindness, but who now understood the necessity of strength and resilience in the face of cruelty. The experience had changed me, but it had also solidified my values and reminded me of the importance of standing up, even when the world around you prefers silence. Gradually, the neighborhood settled into a new normal. The whispers faded, and while some neighbors still looked at me with guarded expressions, others began to thaw, offering small smiles or casual greetings once again. It was as if they'd finally moved on, or perhaps they had come to understand, in their own way, the weight of what I'd endured. I knew things would never be quite the same, but I also knew that I'd earned something priceless, a sense of self-respect, a deeper connection with my own strength, and a newfound commitment to protect those I loved. Regardless of the cost, the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain, but they had become part of my story, a testament to the journey I'd undertaken. In reclaiming my peace, I had learned that sometimes the cost of justice is high, but the reward is invaluable. It was worth every whispered judgment, every questioning look, and every doubt, because I had proven to myself that I could stand up to cruelty, to injustice, and emerge stronger, with a clearer sense of who I was and what I was willing to fight for. As I watched Luna play in the garden, her movements lighter and her spirit restored, I felt a sense of closure settling over me, a quiet peace that had been hard-won but deeply cherished. In our small sanctuary, we had found safety and solace once again, and I knew that whatever came next, we would face it with strength and resilience. Together, in the weeks that followed, the noise around the situation began to settle. The neighborhood gradually moved on, returning to the quiet, unspoken routines that made up our community. The whispers dwindled, and people returned to their own lives, their own concerns. With time, it seemed as if my neighbor's cruelty and the entire ordeal were fading into memory. But for me, the experience had left an indelible mark, a scar, perhaps, but one that I had come to see as a symbol of growth and resilience. I found myself more protective, more careful in ways I hadn't been before. I'd learned to create a balance between openness and caution, finding strength in boundaries that I hadn't valued before. Luna's garden, with its safe, enclosed space and the tall, secure fencing, had become a place of quiet reflection for me. I'd sometimes sit there on warm afternoons, watching her explore, her spirit fully restored, while I sipped coffee and allowed myself to let go of the remnants of bitterness that lingered. She seemed happier, safer, and as she wandered about, chasing stray leaves and basking in the sunlight, I felt that same peace settling over me. One day, as I sat there in the garden, I realized just how much this ordeal had shifted my understanding of my own strength. I had never imagined myself as someone who could go to court, who could stand up in the face of cruelty and fight for what was right. But I had done it. I had faced down a person whose indifference to others had disrupted my family's life. And I'd taken a stand against it. I'd come through it all with a newfound sense of self. And the quiet resilience I felt now was something no one could take from me. Friends who had supported me from the beginning noticed the change, too. Sarah, my closest friend, commented on it one afternoon as we sat together, watching Luna play. "You seem different, you know," she said thoughtfully. "I mean, stronger, like there's a calmness in you that wasn't there before." She was right. The fire of anger and the constant doubt had transformed into something more steady, a sense of calm. A knowledge that I could face what came my way. I'd learned that protecting my peace sometimes required sacrifices, but that those sacrifices were worth it. I'd made a choice to fight for Luna, for my son, for our right to feel safe and respected in our own home. And in doing so, I'd reclaimed parts of myself I hadn't even known I'd lost. The transformation extended to my relationship with my son as well. He'd seen the struggle, the hurt, but he'd also seen resilience and determination. One evening, as I tucked him into bed, he looked up at me with a seriousness that surprised me. "I'm glad you stood up for Luna, Mom," he said, his voice soft but sure. "I know it was hard, but you did it for us." His words, simple and honest, brought a lump to my throat. I hugged him tightly, grateful that he understood, that he'd taken away something meaningful from the experience. He hadn't seen me as the instigator or the troublemaker. He'd seen a mom who protected her family, who fought for what was right. In that moment, I felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that I'd shown him the importance of standing up, of not allowing fear or judgment to dictate what we knew was right. Life gradually settled into a new rhythm, a quieter, more introspective pace. I found myself less concerned with the opinions of those who hadn't supported me, choosing instead to focus on the relationships that had proven steady and true. With every small step forward, every day spent in the peace of our home, the weight of the ordeal faded just a little bit more. I no longer felt the sting of judgment when I walked down the street or passed by certain neighbors. Instead, I walked with my head held high, feeling secure in the choices I'd made and the life I'd built for my son, Luna, and myself. In moments of quiet reflection, I could feel the remnants of tension dissolve, replaced by a simple but profound sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the people who had supported me, for Luna's recovery, and for the strength I had discovered within myself. I had weathered a storm I hadn't expected, and while it had left me changed, it had also left me whole, stronger, wiser. As I watched Luna play in the garden one evening, the sunlight casting a warm glow over her, I felt an undeniable sense of closure. She was free, safe, and content, and in many ways, so was I. The journey had been painful, but I had come out on the other side with a clearer understanding of who I was and what I was capable of. I no longer felt the need to question or justify my actions. I had done what was right, and that knowledge filled me with a quiet, lasting peace. And so, as the days turned into months, I embraced the new rhythm of our lives, letting go of the bitterness and allowing myself to move forward with a heart that was both lighter and stronger. I knew that, no matter what lay ahead, I had the strength to face it, to protect the ones I loved, and to stand firm in my values. In reclaiming my peace, I had reclaimed a part of myself I hadn't realized I'd lost, and that was a gift I would carry with me always.